Good afternoon, students at the Jamaica School of Preaching and Biblical Studies, and good afternoon to all our guests on YouTube who are joining us live or will join us shortly in the archive version. It is a pleasure to have you with us in our class at the Jamaica School of Preaching and Biblical Studies in Kingston, Jamaica. We are looking at communication studies. We're studying basic English language. And today we're going to be looking at not really lesson 10. It would have been lesson 10 if I didn't start a new unit. I made an error by putting lesson 10. It's actually now section 3, dealing with written communication. And in section 3, we have already looked at lesson 1, dealing with the writing of a paragraph. And so this is lesson number 2. If I were following it up from the previous section, we ended the previous section on lesson 8. And if I didn't start a new section, the paragraph would have been lesson 9. And different styles of writing would be lesson 10. But it's actually section 3, written communication, and it is lesson number 2, different styles of writing. The general objective is to examine different styles of writing. The specific objectives are, at the end of this lesson, the students will have been able to define 4 different styles of writing. 2, at the end of this writing of this lesson, the students will have been able to describe 4 different styles of writing. And number 3, at the end of this lesson, the students will have been able to give examples of 4 different styles of writing. Now, this is a very simple lesson, straightforward, and I have always tried to make my lessons relate to the Bible. So even though strictly speaking, this is not a Bible course and is not graded as such, because you are in the Jamaica School of Preaching and Biblical Studies, and because there are different styles of writing in the Bible, I have tried to connect whatever English grammar we are studying with what examples may be found of this grammar in the English translations of the Bible. Now, there are 4 different styles of writing. Number 1 is descriptive. Number 2 is narrative. Number 3 is expository. And number 4 is persuasive. Now, let us look at the meaning of each of these different styles of writing. So here we have the definitions of the 4 different styles of writing. Number 1 is descriptive. This means to write words to let the readers see. Yes.
I also say this slide looks familiar. Did you do this for this?
Well, what happened is that at the end of the last communication studies class, I showed a preview of what we would be studying today. This is actually the slide I had put up, and Brother Norsees asked me if this is all I'm going to teach on this, because he was wondering if he gets tested on this, what is he going to write? Because all I did was to read this, and I didn't say anything about it. So I had put this on as a preview of what we would be doing the following week, which is today. So let us look at the meaning of each of these four different styles of writing. The first style of writing is called descriptive. And let me just bring it down to earth before I continue to read the slide. Now, just a few days ago, in fact on October 12th, that was last week Saturday, I heard a kitten meowing, and the sound was coming from a big garbage container opposite to where I live. But I wasn't certain, because each time I came to the garbage container, the meowing stopped. The kitten stopped crying. So I wasn't certain if I was right in tracing the voice to that garbage container. But when I would leave it and go back over to my yard, I would hear, and it would be coming from the garbage container. So I asked the gardener that works for us once per month, who was there to look after the yard, if he could open the garbage container and see if he could find the kitten that was there. And at first he couldn't find any kitten, but then he saw a bag, and he opened the bag, and I came over to look, and there was a kitten, a baby cat, in the bag. It was lying on its back with its four paws facing me and staring at me, and made no effort to come out of the bag. So I had to take my hands and lift it out. It looked so helpless. Now, if I were to describe that kitten for you, I would tell you what the cat looks like, or what the kitten looks like. It has sparkling eyes. It is yellow in color. Some might say it is gold in color. It was skin and bones. It looked like it wasn't being fed. And it was very much out of breath, like it didn't get enough oxygen while it was in the bag. What I have done is describe the cat to you. And when you do that in writing, by saying what the kitten looks like, or how the person sounded, or what the flowers smelled like, or how the food tasted, you are doing descriptive writing. So going now to the slide, descriptive. This means to write words to let the readers see, hear, smell, touch, and taste what a person, place, or thing looks like, sounds like, smells like, feels like, or tastes like. Use is made of adjectives, similes, metaphors, and other literary devices. Now, going back to adjectives, they are words that describe. Similes compare one thing to another. Metaphors are implied comparisons, so they will not say as or like, but will just say, like Jesus said at the Last Supper, concerning the bread, this is my body. Concerning the fruit of the vine, this is my blood. He didn't say this is like my body or this is like my blood, but he used the metaphor of implied comparison. So these are different ways of bringing out what something looks like or what something feels like to make the reader get a good idea, a good mental picture of what the thing is that you are describing. The Psalms is full of this kind of writing. For example, the Lord is my shepherd. So there is a metaphor, an implied comparison between God and a shepherd. Just as a shepherd loves the sheep, God loves his people. Just as a shepherd will provide food for his sheep, drink for his sheep, God provides us with our daily food and our daily drink. Just as a shepherd will try to heal any wound that any of his sheep get, God is our healer. Just as a shepherd will protect his sheep from danger, God protects us from danger. So David, who was a shepherd himself, used the metaphor of God as a shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd. In the song that Moses wrote after the crossing of the Red Sea, he referred to God as a man of war. In other words, God is being metaphorically compared to a soldier, a strong soldier, because God fought for Israel against the Egyptians. He divided the Red Sea for the Israelites to go across. He let the Red Sea collapse on the Egyptians and drown them. So Moses sang about God as a man of war. Also, we find in the Psalms that David speaks about God as his shield, because just as how a warrior in those days would use a shield to protect himself from arrows and spears so that he's not killed, God is our protector from danger. So descriptive writing is found very much in the Psalms. It is also found in the Song of Solomon. We'll be looking at that shortly. Narrative, number 2. This means to write words to tell a story. The word narrative itself means storytelling. So it is writing a story. The story may be real, such as nonfiction, or it may be made up by the writer, such as fiction. And it consists of scenes. That is, when you're reading a narrative, it will tell you where this story happened. It will tell you when it happened. Okay, so it gives you the scene. You will have the different characters, the person who is standing up for what is right, the person who is against the person who is standing up for what is right. So you have the different characters. You have problems that have to be solved in that narrative. And towards the end of the narrative, there is a solution of the problem that was introduced in the beginning of the narrative. More on that later shortly. Number 3, you have expository. How many of you have heard the word expository preaching? Could you raise your hand? Expository preaching. Have you heard expository preaching? Have you heard it? Okay. Expository. This means to write words to explain, to give information, to impart facts to the reader. So the emphasis in this kind of writing is not to describe. It is not to tell stories, but it is to define. It is to explain. It is to give facts, statistics. Then you have persuasive, number 4. This means to write words to convince the readers about the truth of what you are writing about, and to lead them to act on the information that you are writing about. This is what lawyers do all the time. In the court, you will have the prosecuting lawyer who wants to prove that A is guilty as charged. Then you have the defense lawyer who is going to defend A by proving that the evidences brought against A do not apply to him or should not be brought up in court. He's going to try to persuade the court that A is not guilty, or that there is some doubt, some reasonable doubt for us to conclude that he is guilty. So lawyers do that. So that's persuasive. Concerning persuasive, did you hear, I think it was on Monday gone, which was October 14. There was a court case in the Supreme Court in downtown Kingston, Jamaica. And the case involved a certain homosexual activist in Jamaica and the Caribbean who had gone to the mayor of Montego Bay seeking permission to rent the Montego Bay Cultural Center to have a week of meetings promoting same-sex marriage in Jamaica. The mayor of Montego Bay turned down the request, refused to give this activist permission to rent the premises, and the man went to the court and applied for the case to be tried in court. And the judge reached a decision on Monday that the mayor should not have prevented this activist from using the facility to promote same-sex marriage, and that he had overstepped his authority by refusing to give this activist permission. And I do not know what argument was presented in defense of the mayor, because I was not there, and I didn't see it in the newspapers in Jamaica. But what I do know is when lawyers go into the courtroom, they do their best to win their case, whether it is to prosecute someone or whether it is to defend someone. And so when you're writing a persuasive piece of writing, you are trying to bring evidence to convince your readers that your point of view is right. In my case, I was astonished at the Supreme Court's decision. And the reason I'm astonished is this: the Offenses Against the Persons Act, Section 76 to 79, states that buggery is unnatural and that it is a criminal offense, that a person may get some time in prison if it can be proven that the person engaged in buggery. And therefore, to have a week of meetings at a public government building set aside for cultural events in Jamaica to persuade the Jamaican public and visitors from overseas and influence them to practice something that is unlawful, it should have been clear to the judge that no permission should be given. For the legal principle is this: if you're giving permission to someone to promote the breaking of some law in a country, then what is the sense of doing that when you are going to be encouraging more people to break a particular law? Let me give you some examples. In Montego Bay, they have a problem with what is called scamming. They will call people in the United States, especially old people, and persuade them that they have won a big fortune in Jamaica. But they need to pay a certain amount of money in order for the fortune to be sent to them. And some of these elderly people have been persuaded, yes. And they have sent their money over to these people only to realize that what they were telling them about winning a large fortune was not true. So scamming is what we call it. Fooling people up, tricking people into getting their money. So what if another activist was to ask the mayor of Montego Bay, we want to use your cultural center to teach people the art or the skill of scamming people? Would the Supreme Court judge have given permission to that person to do it? I don't think so. What if it were an activist that is engaged in human trafficking? Did you know that there are some parents in Jamaica that take their children and sell them as slaves to human traffickers to be used for sexual purposes, to get money for themselves? That's what you call human trafficking. What if another activist were to go to the mayor of Montego Bay asking to use the cultural center in order to persuade people to join in the business of human trafficking? Would the judge of the Supreme Court have given such a permission? I don't think so. What persuaded that judge to make that decision? I am not certain. But what I do know is it's not a complicated case. Since it is a matter of encouraging people to break a particular law of the government in Jamaica, I don't understand how a judge could make the ruling that this person may use a government facility to promote the breaking of a particular law in Jamaica. It doesn't make sense. But it is in persuasive writing that even if someone else does not agree with what you are saying, you present your evidence in such a compelling way that they might eventually accept your point of view. And that is what is meant to be persuasive. In our case, we are trying to persuade people to do what God wants them to do, not to trick them or deceive them. So we have looked at different styles of writing. Descriptive, in which you make use of adjectives, similes, metaphors. Narrative, which is storytelling. Expository, that is explaining, defining, giving statistics, imparting facts. Number 4, persuasive, trying to convince the readers about what you are writing about. Now let us look at some examples in the Bible of these 4 different styles of writing. First of all, we have descriptive. And we find this in Song of Solomon, chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. And this is Solomon speaking to one of his wives. Solomon had not yet married 700 wives and 300 concubines, but he still had some wives. And this is what he said to one of them in the King James Version. Behold, thou art fair, my love. That's Old English. Fair means to be beautiful. Behold, thou art fair, my love. Behold, thou art fair. Thou hast dove's eyes within thy locks. Now notice, dove's eyes. Now, did this particular wife of Solomon literally have the eyes of a dove? No, this is what you call metaphor, an implied comparison. Her eyes resembled that of a dove. Okay, so he describes her as having dove's eyes within her locks. Thy hair is as. Now, when you see the word as or like, that is a device called simile, in which you're showing similarities between one thing and another. Behold, thy hair is as a flock of goats that appear from Mount Gilead. Now, when you see the image of a mountain, let's say this is Mount Gilead, east of the Sea of Galilee, and you're standing at the foot and looking at a large number of goats coming down the hillside, the mountainside. That is what Solomon is describing concerning the hair of one of his favorite wives. Your hair is as a flock of goats coming down the mountain of Gilead. And so that is what you call descriptive writing, in which there are metaphors, implied comparisons, and similes, that is, a comparison introduced by the words as or like. Let me give you another example. Song of Solomon, as you can see up there, chapter 7, and verses 1 and 2. How beautiful are thy feet with shoes, O princess daughter. The joints of thy thighs are like jewels. Notice the word like, the use of a simile, in which he compares the joints of her thighs to something precious like jewels. The work of the hands of a cunning workman, that is, her thighs and her joints have been skillfully made. Verse 2, thy navel is like a round goblet. That is a large circular glass in which it was customary to drink wine or some other strong drink. Thy navel is like a round goblet. Here again, you have simile introduced by the word like, which wanteth not liquor, that is, it is not lacking in strong drink. Thy belly is like an heap of wheat set about with lilies. So that's what descriptive writing is like. It makes use of metaphors, it makes use of similes, it makes use of adjectives. Any question on descriptive writing? Okay, let us look at narrative. Examples of narrative. Now, the first narrative that I have there is from the book of Genesis, an interesting story, true story about Joseph, one of the sons of Jacob. That takes up a lot of pages in Genesis. I will read that part of the story for us. Now Israel, that is Jacob, loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a coat of many colors. And when his brethren saw that their father loved him more than all his brethren, they hated him and could not speak peaceably unto him. And then another part of Genesis, near to the end of Genesis, God sent me before you. This is Joseph speaking to his brothers many years later. God sent me before you to preserve you a posterity, that is, descendants, in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you that sent me hither, but God, and he hath made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. Now here is the story. Quite an interesting story. Jacob had 12 sons and 1 daughter. And one of his sons was Joseph. He loved Joseph very much because he was the firstborn son of his favorite wife, Rachel. You know that Jacob wanted to marry Rachel only. She was the only one he really wanted to marry. But the father of Rachel deceived him and gave him the older daughter Leah, so he ended up marrying her without even knowing it, because she was brought to his bedroom in the night, and it was dark and he couldn't see her face. But in the morning he was able to see that this was not Rachel, this was Leah. Anyway, he ended up getting the second daughter, the younger one, Rachel, but he had to work for another 7 years. And the firstborn son of his favorite wife, Rachel, was Joseph. So he loved Joseph more than he loved his other children. And he showed this love by making a special coat for Joseph. And because Joseph was having dreams about his father and his mother and his brothers bowing down to him, the brothers became jealous. They were jealous that his father was treating Joseph so special, and they were jealous because Joseph was having dreams about how great he would become, even greater than his parents. So they hated Joseph, and one day when they saw Joseph coming to them, they put him in a pit. And later, when they saw some Ishmaelite traders coming, they took Joseph out of the pit and sold him as a slave to these people, who sold him as a slave to Potiphar, a commander of Pharaoh's bodyguard. And that's how Joseph ended up in Egypt. But Joseph eventually became the governor of Egypt, from being a slave to being the governor of Egypt next to Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And it was because God showed Joseph that there would be 7 years of plenty in the land, followed by 7 years of famine, that Joseph was able to get Pharaoh to put aside food during the 7 years of plenty, so that there would be enough food during the 7 years of famine to feed the Egyptians and to feed anybody from anywhere suffering in the famine, including Joseph's family in the land of Canaan. So it worked out quite well. That's a narrative. That's a true story of how Joseph was sold into Egypt, but God worked it out for the best for Joseph's family. Joseph ended up feeding his father, feeding his brothers, their children, their wives, their flocks, and saving the descendants of Jacob so that they could become a great nation in Egypt. Here is another example of narrative. Let's turn to Exodus chapter 3, beginning at verse 1. And reading to verse 10. Now Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the back of the desert and came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. And Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. Before I read further, do you notice that we had a test this morning on the Hebrew conjunction? Can anybody identify the Hebrew conjunction in this English translation? Whenever you see the word and, it is the Hebrew conjunction that is translated. Now, the Hebrew language uses the conjunction far more often than the English language does. So even in an English translation, it looks as if too many ands are being used. But there's a reason for that, which you will learn about later on. That one of the uses of the conjunction is to move from one event to the other. That is called wow consecutive. Some people call it wow historical. It is one of the features of narrative or storytelling in the Hebrew language. And this is also what tells you that we're looking at narrative or storytelling. So verse 3 says, and Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called unto him out of the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Draw not nigh hither. Put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people, which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. And I am come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land unto a good land and a large, unto a land flowing with milk and honey, unto the place of the Canaanites, and the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel is come unto me, and I have also seen the oppression wherewith the Egyptians oppressed them. Come now therefore, and I will send thee unto Pharaoh, that thou mayest bring forth my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Well, there in the narrative, you see the problem introduced in chapter 3. Actually, it was from chapter 1 when we read about the Hebrews being enslaved. But now there is the beginning of a solution to that problem in God calling Moses to go to Egypt and bring the Hebrews out of their slavery and lead them to the land that God had promised the ancestors of the Hebrews, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay, so narrative is storytelling, and there is a lot of narrative or true storytelling in the Bible. Not made up stories, but true storytelling in the Bible. So today we have looked at the examples of descriptive writing in the Song of Solomon, which is a love song between Solomon and one of his favorite wives, in which she's compared, her eyes are compared to dove's eyes, her hair is compared to a flock of goats going down Mount Gilead, her thigh is said to be made by a skillful workman. The joints of her thighs are like jewels. And the narrative of Joseph being the favorite son of Jacob and being sold into Egypt as a slave, ending up being governor and saving the Egyptians and the Hebrews and all nations from starvation. And God calling Moses at the burning bush to bring the Hebrew slaves out of their slavery into freedom and to give them the land, rich and fertile land in the land of Canaan. So God permitting, next week we will continue at expository. We will look at examples of expository writing in the Bible. Any question? Yes.
It was listen to not for example, I mean my North Sea.
Yes.
Um, I know Joseph, the son of Jacob. One Jacob called Israel and Joseph. What is the second name?
For Jacob,
No,
for Joseph,
Joseph, yes,
or why he called the name of that son Joseph.
yes.
Or Joseph is a Hebrew word that means may the Lord add, meaning may the Lord add some other son or child to what my wife has given birth to. So it was expressing the wish that he get another son or child from his wife Rachel. It literally translated means the Lord adds. Yosef in Hebrew means the Lord adds. So he's asking me the Lord add another child. Okay. In telling me that you are from Haiti, were you trying to make a story? Were you trying to explain, communicate a story? All right. Okay, any other question? All right then. So I'll send this to you later on today, and we'll continue at number 3 on this slide, examples of 4 different writing styles next week. Okay, thank you. May you have math next, don't you? Mathematics?
No, it put off until tomorrow because he's going to do our exam.
All right, okay. Okay, well, Lord willing, I will see you tomorrow. Remember to get yourself ready for your apologetics test, years 1 to 3. You'll be tested on lesson number 9, which is atheists using suffering to try to prove that there is no God. So if you haven't prepared for the apologetics test yet, make sure you get prepared as soon as you can. That's the only test you'll be getting tomorrow. Apologetics, lesson number 9 on suffering. That's the lesson we did last week. Okay then. And thanks for joining us on the internet. I'll see you tomorrow if God will.